There was once a little village that was almost big enough to be called a town. And in that village, there lived a man, quite a young man, but he had inherited a house. And in the house, he had discovered that there were great wooden chests that were full of silver and golden coins, which he began to spend almost immediately. He bought himself fine brocade waistcoats that buttoned with shiny silver buttons. He served guests with drinks in cut glass crystal. And he even acquired a pocket watch that was all the rage and cost a fortune. Now, of course, if you spend money in that kind of way, it soon dwindles to almost nothing at all. And there he discovered one day that there was only one chest left. But he had a plan, and he called it a vision for the future. But he couldn't do it alone. So, on market day, he started a rumour, and it spread from stallholder to stallholder, and from stallholder to customer, and from customer to customer to customer, until everybody was talking about it, of how they could make their fortunes if they met on the edge of the woods at dawn the very next day. Everybody knew that the woods had been important in the development of that little village that was almost a town. Older folks said it was what the town was built on, and in a lot of ways they were right. After all, the houses were timber framed or had wooden floorboards, and it still provided materials that were used to whittle and turn spoons and bowls and craft stools and benches. It gave fuel for fires, for warmth and to cook with. And in past times, in the times of grandfathers and great-grandmothers and great-great-grandfathers and great-great-great-grandmothers, acorns were gathered and used to make flour. And although now it had been tamed, divided and coppiced, it still provided a deep, dark green, shady canopy on a hot summer's day. It was full of birds and insects and creatures that ran and scampered over roots and under branches. It was still the kind of place that it was possible to get lost in. So children were told to stick to the paths. And if you went in deep enough, you could feel that there were trees that remembered the time when the land had been covered by wild woods, and you knew that this was a fragment of that. The next morning, a large crowd made its way from the village down to the woods, because there were many that lived there who needed an extra coin or two to feed hungry mouths. And when they arrived, they saw that wealthy young man stood on top of a cart, and the cart was covered in sackcloth. As the crowd settled, he announced, "Who here wishes to make a coin or two?" And he held up a coin and he flipped it up in the air, and it spun over and over and glinted in the morning sunlight. And as it landed in his other hand, a huge cheer from the crowd went up. And so he continued, "Who here isn't afraid of hard work Another cheer went up from the crowd. And now he leapt off the cart and he threw back the sackcloth and he revealed that there was row upon row of axes with newly sharpened blades. And he explained, a tree for a coin, of how they would cut down the forest, of how they would sell the timber for profit, and how they would make a road from their village all the way to the next, that they might travel at double quick speed, faster than they had ever been able to before. And another cheer went up from the crowd, and one or two even began to take a step forward. But then, just as the young man had lifted up an axe and made his way to the very edge of the woods and raised it about to strike a tree, a little lad, he pushed his way through to the front and he wiped his snotty nose on the back of his hand and he said, "Here, mister, stop. Me nan says you shouldn't cut down that tree because this is the hawthorn tree, mister. You know, the fairy tree." Mr. Silver Buttons was just about to laugh and scoff at this when he noticed that everybody was nodding. Well, they'd all heard a version of that story, of how the hawthorn, the fairy tree, had fairy gold buried at its roots, or that it protected the forest, or brought luck to the town, and that it would be a bad day for anyone that tried to cut it down. At that point, some people simply left and went back to the little town, but their voices carried on the breeze and they rang out as clear as bells. I was already too sad about the idea of chopping down the trees. Of course, don't chop down the trees. They are our companions. Now, Mr. Silver Buttons did not want to lose any more people. So he quickly reached into his pocket and produced 2 coins. 2 coins for 1 tree. Come on, who will follow me? The people that remained, that slightly reduced crowd, followed Mr. Silver Buttons into the cool of the late summer forest. Now, they had not gone very far when he stopped and pointed at a tree. But this was the beech tree, and her branches stretched out wide, and they had sheltered many a weary traveller and their horse. Nobody wanted to chop down the beech tree. And Mr. Silver Buttons didn't want to lose any more people, and so he agreed. Of course, let us not chop down the beech tree. But as they left, he threw back over his shoulder, "Not yet, anyway." And although the crowd did not hear him, the trees felt it. And the little saplings that grew at the beech tree's roots shivered and shook and passed the message back all the way to the hawthorn tree. The little party journeyed deeper into the forest through the dappled light of summer as it peered through the branches and fell on their faces and their arms. And then they stopped. This one But an old man, almost bent double with age, came forward and pointed a twisted, gnarled finger towards the trunk. Not this one. That tree held a special memory for him. He had carved his initials into it when he had been a young man. It was the place that he had sat with a young woman who later on became his wife. Mr. Silver Buttons scoffed and laughed. What a ridiculous reason! But others had already come forward. Didn't he realise that this was the sweet chestnut tree? And the sweet chestnuts were not yet ready. It would be a sorry midwinter if there were no chestnuts to roast on the fire. And even Mr. Silver Buttons had to agree. He was rather partial to the odd roast chestnut himself. They would leave the chestnut tree alone. But as they moved off, he muttered to the topmost branches of how they would be back once the fruits had been picked and gathered. And the whisper of the leaves carried that message far and wide across the forest and all the way back to the hawthorn. And as that little party journeyed on, everybody had a reason, a different reason for each of the trees that they passed. And so for a while, Mr. Silver Buttons grew quiet. He needed a tree that would fetch such a good price. It would capture their imaginations. And suddenly, there it was before him. It was a great old oak tree. It had stood for more than 100 years. And Mr. Silver Buttons knew that this one would fetch an excellent price. My friends, gather round. This is the tree for us. Look, I will give you not 2, not 3, but 4 coins for anybody who will help me chop this one down. 4 coins. That was nothing to be sniffed at all. But everybody shook their heads. Nobody would have any part in chopping down the great old oak. I mean, it would take 50, 60 years for another to even begin to produce acorns. And more than that, this was the tree where the old eagle owl lived. The one, you know, with the 6-foot wingspan. The one that kept the rats down in the village and the forest and the town. And now the afternoon was drawing on, and no one wanted to be left in the forest after dark. So they all made their way back home to the little village, the almost town. Now you'd think that that would be an end of things, but it wasn't, because Mr. Silver Buttons had learned nothing at all. In fact, the next morning, he proved himself to be less wise than he had been the day before. He got up with a new plan. He would cut down that hawthorn tree. That would show everybody, and then they would all be on his side. They would all work for him, and before he knew where he was, he would be rich and the forest would be felled. He would lead by example. And so he made his way, in his horse and his cart with his axe in the back, down to the woods once more. He smirked at the hawthorn, and he began to chop and chop away. and he listed all of the trees that he would cut down. And when that hawthorn fell, he saw that there was no fairy gold at its roots. And so he began to slice it up into firewood. It would burn well in his hearth that winter. He could roast chestnuts on it. In fact, he could almost smell the fire now, the smoke in his nostrils. He made his way back to that little town, and as he arrived just as the sun set and the moon rose, he saw that people ran backwards and forwards and forwards and back, each carrying buckets of water. And there before him, his house was ablaze. And eventually there was just cinder and ash. Everybody felt sorry for him until they looked in the back of his cart and saw the hawthorn chopped up into tiny little bits. They said, well, that's what you get when you mess with the woods that were once the wild woods and are still a fragment of that.